Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Jhon Didier Trujillo Wash Process Colombia from Aviary Coffee. And there's the box right there. And Aviary, based out of Cleveland, Ohio. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. This is their coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. Aviary is, of course, the relatively new roaster from coffee consultant Christopher Farron, and one of the most discussed coffee roasters this year as well, as it has received a lot of praise and acclaim since its inception. And like with most new coffee roasters, I was waiting to either get some feedback about the roaster or a suggestion or recommendation from you guys before reviewing them. But given how much praise I'd heard about Aviary, I decided it was time to check them out for ourselves. So we'll see how this coffee turned out, as this right here is day 47. And recipe we went with for this coffee was actually a little different because we opted for the April brewer. So it was a 15:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And as mentioned, we did prefer the April brewer as our brew method for this coffee, which does signify a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this coffee, as fully expected going into purchasing Aviary, I was fully expecting Christopher to go a lot lighter on his coffees in general, and that was definitely the case with this one right here. As you can tell that this one's notably lighter than even some of the more recent coffees we've had from Say as well, which I know a lot of people have said that they've pushed the development on their coffees a little bit more, but you can definitely tell that this one's on the lighter side even compared to that coffee or those coffees. So that's to say that this is a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 21, first impression, and we did opt for the V60, and the cup wasn't overly well defined right off brew, as it was offering a generic palm fruit brightness that did have a little bit more as the cup cooled down. Otherwise, it was pretty in line with previous experiences of Giroso coffees, with some softer tropical profiles that open up in the sweetness as the cup does cool down. And opting to take this as our first coffee from Aviary was kind of an interesting choice. It was suggested to us when the order was available to purchase this coffee to buy this one, and I'd said that I've honestly had mixed experiences with Giroso coffees in general, so I didn't know if this one was the best one to start with, but it offered plenty of the Giroso-like qualities, and we're going to see how much of that held true for the entirety of this one. As on day 24, we opted for the Chemex, and it did improve this time around, as there was notably more sugariness to the cup and more tropics pronounced right off brew. The cup does continue to remain reminiscent of some of the Sage Girosos I've actually had in the past, but it still feels like the best is ahead of this coffee, as even though we were told that around the 3-week mark, day 21 mark, the coffee was ready to be brewed, I still felt like the coffee still had a little bit more time that it needed to really open up and improve from this point. Day 27, through the April brewer, and the cup was massively improved from the previous days. It was notably sweeter with plenty of the listed sugariness in a significantly more abundant manner. Much more reminiscent of the Sage Girosos of the past, once again with those sugary stone fruits and tropical sweetness yet again. So this was a huge improvement from some of the earlier days, and I started to feel like, okay, the coffee is finding its footing, so from this point going forward, we're probably going to experience the best of this one. And on day 30, we opted for the V60 with Aviary's suggested recipe, which isn't really overly defined. It's actually just switching from a 16:1, which is what we started with, to a 17:1 water to coffee ratio. But we didn't have a temperature or anything else to really work with, so that's all the adjustments that we made, was just kind of lowering the overall concentration of this coffee. And it does continue to remain reminiscent of our first experience, with the tropical aspects being a little bit more pronounced and bright relative to the sugary sweetness. So the sugary sweetness was still there, but I would say that through this brew method, not quite as prominent and pronounced. A slight bit of a citric bitterness that's in line with the listed grapefruit, and more of the sweetness in the cool down. And this is a really good opportunity to kind of discuss that bitterness, because it was present on the first time we tried it. I just didn't necessarily feel like it was worth noting. I kind of attributed that to maybe the coffee being a little bit too early to brew. But this time around, given that it was present again, I said, okay, it seems to be a factor within this one, and it makes a lot of sense that there's a bit of citric note that's listed on this coffee, especially given that that's what we're continuing to experience with it. Day 33 through the Chemex with Aviary suggested recipe, and it's reminiscent of our second impression in a slightly toned down sense with the mostly tropical forward aspects and a complementary citric bitterness and palm fruit brightness, skewing more on the citric side of things and sweet side of things. So this one was notably more rounded, but at the same time I didn't necessarily enjoy the fact that we were going away from the best experience of the coffee, that of course being the sweeter attributes and a little bit more of those sugary profiles to it. Day 36 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and it's really interesting to me just how stark of a difference there was between the brew methods that we had for this coffee, because it's extremely rare to have a coffee that turns out so different between brew methods, at least in this manner, because for whatever reason, anytime we brewed it with the V60, it just came out notably more bitter, especially in regards to the citric tones of this one. There's still some nice sugary sweetness, but the fruit bitterness is just much more vocalized in this brewer relative to some of the other brew methods that we had had for this coffee up to this point. And while I thought that maybe this was just something with me, I did have at least 2 other people that said, for whatever reason, anytime they brewed it with the V60, the cup just came out a little bit different, and that was in line with my own experiences, so that did kind of reassure and validate my own thoughts on it. Well, we move on to day 39 as we opted for the Chemex with Aviary suggested recipe once again, and there's just inconsistency all around as it feels toned down with the mostly citric forward quality yet again. There is a subtlety to the sugary sweetness, but not quite as intense in that regard as far as the tropicality either when it comes to some of the earlier days that we had had of this coffee. So day 42, that's why we opted to go back to the April brewer, because that experience we had with the April brewer was the best experience we'd had of this coffee, and tinkering and trying to adjust this coffee didn't necessarily lend itself towards better results. So we tried it one more time, and this was once again better. So this was probably the second best day we had of this coffee, the first of course being the first time we brewed it through the April brewer, and that's why I just felt like for whatever reason the April brewer offered a little bit more consistency and a well-rounded cup of coffee, as it does seem to accentuate a little bit of the citric bitterness, but significantly less so than some of the earlier experiences we had had. Reminiscent of the listed grapefruit yet again, an unripened pineapple, a slightly bitter peach, and a slight bit of passion fruit as well. Plenty to take out from that, plenty of those slightly syrupy churroso-like characteristics, a little bit of an herbal spice tone that's also present within churroso coffees, so plenty of depth in this one, but that kind of takes us into the tasting wheel, so let's go ahead and put that up so you can see what we are getting. And we have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. Obviously, there's nothing to really take away from the overall cleanliness of this coffee. I would say that even if a coffee does turn out extremely citric bitter, I don't think that that's necessarily going to take away from the cleanliness. If anything, if it's overly well defined, it could kind of bump up the overall clarity of a coffee, but nonetheless, plenty of just expected clean profiles within this one, so cleanliness definitely justified there at that level 4 mark. Finish, level 4, and this is where things are going to be slightly down for this coffee, because once again it had a lot of the bitter qualities to it, and even when we were brewing this one with the April brewer, which seemed to tone down a little bit of those qualities, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was quite as abundant as it had been on earlier days, but even then it's the most prominent component within the finish, coupled with the sugary aspects as well as that kind of tropical nectar. So I think if I was able to get maybe significantly less of those slightly citric bitter qualities and much more of that sugariness, then I probably would have enjoyed this coffee significantly more, but I wanted to highlight all 3 of those things as all of them were present within the finish. Sweetness, level 4, and I know it's kind of a cliche or just throwaway to say that it has churroso-like sweetness, but I've kind of noticed finally after having had so many churroso coffees that they do tend to offer this interesting sort of mix of sugary and tropical components within them, and that's what I was experiencing within this coffee for the entirety of it. Even when it was skewing a lot more on the bitter citric side of things, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was ever sacrificing too much of the sugary sweetness. So level 4, I would say a pretty consistent note on this one throughout. Acidity, level 4, obviously fully expected this one to be very bright, and it was very bright, and came in a number of directions. Of course, the citric brightness, and in addition to that, a little bit of a palm fruit brightness as well. So just a lot of citric qualities, and given the roast profile of this coffee, that was always fully expected within it. Citrus fruit, level 4, and I think I've kind of been beating that horse at this point because the more citric bitter qualities were present within this one for the entirety of it, and I would say that it was the most dominant factor for me in this coffee specifically. Even outside of that, I could say that there was enough of maybe a citric tropicality. I previously mentioned that slightly more unripened pineapple-like attribute that was present within it. That justifies this one reaching that level 4 mark, and it's never going to be a big selling point to me, scoring a level 4 for the citrus and nothing higher for any of the other qualities within the fruit components. So that's what it is. Outside of that, though, you have to kind of put the palm fruit brightness, as I've always said. There's not really anywhere else to put that for this tasting wheel. So a lot of citric qualities within this one. And then that takes us to our level 3s, and we'll start with the body level 3. That is kind of interesting. I think that this one had a little bit more body to it. Obviously, the concentration is significantly higher at a 15-1 with the April brewer, but it did just seem to have a little bit more texture to it in general, which I think gives this one a little bit more additional depth as well. Florality, level 3, and that's something that I usually experience when it comes to Chirroso coffees, as they do have this soft kind of floral component that can complement what is sometimes a little bit more of a robust syrupiness within the tropicality itself. Berry fruit, level 3. I briefly mentioned getting a little bit of that passion fruit-like tone. There's definitely a little bit of some tropical berry aspects that are present within this coffee as well. Stone fruit, level 3, and while I said early on that maybe there was a little bit more of a peachiness, I think I can see a little bit more of a tropical stone fruit, something a little bit more in line with a mango-like characteristic that's present within this one. Even then, there's enough of a stone fruit-like component to justify it being there at that level 3 mark. Caramel, level 3. I think that that's the interesting brown sugar. If I recall correctly, I think that there's some sort of sugary note that's present on this coffee, and that's what I decided to put for the caramel, as there's definitely plenty of that within this coffee. It definitely has plenty of sugariness to it. Once again, something I experience with a lot of Chirroso coffees in general. And then that, of course, takes us to probably the most important thing within this tasting wheel, and that is the bitterness level 3. And I'm extremely curious to hear your guys' feedback on this coffee, if you also experienced that when brewing this coffee, because for me, I really thought that there was something wrong every time I was brewing this coffee, but just hearing the feedback that it turned out a little bit weird in that way for a lot of, or I guess I should say a couple of other people, it just really seemed to validate that feeling that every time I was brewing this coffee, it just seemed to come out a little bit more that way. And there were times I was making adjustments and it was diluted, but for the most part, it was an ever-present quality within it. And for that reason, it scores relatively high on this tasting wheel, higher than I would have expected at the level 3 mark. Again, there's that grapefruit note listed on here, so maybe that's fully expected with what should have been present within this coffee. But as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like there are two really important things I want to say about it. And the first of which being that I actually really like the roast profile of this coffee. I think it's pretty nice for a number of reasons. Obviously, the lightness is in line with my own preferences, so I enjoyed that aspect of it. But I think at the end of the day, I just don't necessarily think that I liked the actual coffee itself to begin with. Like, this Chirroso specifically doesn't necessarily seem like my sort of thing, because I think a lot of the flavor profile is slightly skewed away from my own preferences. But as I've already mentioned, I seem to have mixed reaction to Chirroso coffees. For the most part, I find them to be a little bit more tame and moderate relative to some of the other varietals that I might enjoy a little bit more. There are obviously exceptions for coffees that may be extraordinarily well defined, but this one right here, I feel like while on paper it sounded like a type of coffee I would enjoy, it sounded like a very sweet coffee, it sounded like a very tropical coffee. I think at the end of the day, skewing specifically in a direction that I wasn't necessarily enjoying kind of did take away from that overall experience. So that's to say, I'm very curious about Aviary's future releases, and I'm definitely hoping to review some more of them in the future. For anybody that's not familiar, their coffees do tend to sell out pretty quickly as well. That being said, it's caught enough of my interest to maybe want to try one of their more processed coffees. Outside of that, maybe something that does sound a little bit more in line with my own preferences. I just don't necessarily think that this one was in line with those preferences, and for that reason, I'm not necessarily taking too much away from this coffee. It's just basically to say that I'm very curious to see what else Avary does here in the near future. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and I know this is a cop-out, but I'm essentially going to say somebody that likes their light profile Chirroso coffees, because this is honestly a great fit for that. It offered plenty of those Chirroso-like qualities to it. That tropicality, that sugary sweetness, that brightness, and in addition to that, it just seemed to have the characteristics that you've come to somewhat expect from it. As I mentioned, it's not quite as consistent as something like a Mejorada, which seems to have a bunch of consistent themes to it, but outside of that, it still seems to offer just some really nice depth to it, as there was variety to it, the slightly more citric tones to it, the tropicality to it, and as previously mentioned, that sugariness to it. So a lot of positives to take away from it. Best direction I could point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Jhon Didier Trujillo wash processed Colombia from Aviary Coffee. Thank you for watching.